Hey guys, it's Bridget with San Diego Seed Company, and today I'm going to show you the 4 most important things you have to remember when you're planting your starts out in the fall or in any climate that's really hot. So specifically I'm talking about zone 9 and 10, but this information is applicable in any area where the temperatures can be really warm and it can really affect the way your plants live when you transplant them. So before I get into that, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button so you're notified anytime we put out a video. All right, so if you are binge watching our videos, which I hope you are, we have tons of videos before this where I go through all of the details about what you need to know on how to start your plants, what things to look for, how to troubleshoot issues, everything you need to know. Now we're at the point where we're actually going to transplant them out. And this, unfortunately, is a time when people make very common mistakes that really end up in having fried, wilted, dead transplants. That's very frustrating because you spent all this time, energy, and money to grow the transplants. So I want to help you prevent that from happening. So we're going to go over 4 things that you need to do, especially if you're in zone 9 and 10, you have to do to be successful when you transplant out. Okay, now before we get into that, I want to put a shout out to these awesome rad hats that we had made locally. Daisy Designs and Ramona made these. They're so cool. Don't judge me by my hair, but look at that. They're my favorite because they're really wide brimmed, keep the sun off your face, and they have our cool logo. And in this video, I'm gonna be giving one away to a lucky winner. So please make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and you join our newsletter so you can be notified when we choose you as a winner for this super rad hat. All right, so just a reminder, comment on this video so you can be entered to win your very own San Diego Seed Company sun hat. Okay, so let's actually take these starts. Let's go into the garden just like you would, and let's go through every single step you need to know to plant them out with success. Come on. Okay, so the 4 most important, crucial things that you need to remember when you're planting out any transplants in hot areas of the United States, so zone 9 and 10 particularly, but even in the spring when the weather is kind of mild, you still should consider all of these things as very important steps to take to ensure that your transplants really do well. So number 1, this is so critically important. When I teach my classes, I always tell people, you never, ever, 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 ever plant transplants into dry soil. Think about that and why that's important. If you take this little tender transplant and you pull it out, you break up the roots, and then you stick it in dry soil, what's going to happen is that dry soil is going to act like a sponge, and it is going to suck every bit of moisture that is around these roots away from it, and the plant is more likely to wilt. That is absolutely critical if you're in zone 9 and 10 or very hot climates, because it's likely that your soil can be very dry to begin with. Now, what you also can't do, if you want to be successful, is plant it in dry soil and then water. And that's because really dry soil is hydrophobic and it's going to take a while to grab onto the moisture. So the number 1 tip is you want to pre-water. You want to water well before you're going to plant your transplants to ensure that the soil is actually really moist. What I like to tell people, especially if they're planting in raised beds, is take your hose and put it on top of the raised bed and put it on just a little drip, 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 just barely any water coming out, and leave it on there for potentially several hours so that the whole bed is absolutely moist all the way through and you have a really large sponge to hold on to moisture. The biggest, most common mistake that gardeners make when they transplant out their baby transplants is there's not enough moisture for the transplants. They end up wilting and dying. They're young, they're tender, they need to remain moist the whole time. So what I'm gonna do here is, I've got my little garden space here, and we actually recently put down some weed cloth because we have some really terrible weeds, and I want to hold in some moisture when I can. I've got this on drip irrigation, okay? Now, I have been irrigating for the last 2 weeks, even though there's nothing been planted here. That's because I want to keep moisture in the soil, and I want to guarantee that when I do come to transplant, the soil looks nice and moist. Now, look at this. There's still roots from other plants here. You can tell there is moisture in that soil. You do not want it to be dry. Now, an old farmer's trick that has been used forever is you grab the soil, squeeze it together. If it stays together, then you know you have enough moisture in the soil to transplant. If it just falls apart immediately, you know it's too dry. Now, your soil doesn't need to be saturated where you squeeze it and a bunch of moisture comes out, but there should be enough moisture to at least guarantee that the plant is not going to dry out the moment you put it in the soil. So that's number one. Now, I've been doing this for over a decade and I've seen probably thousands of gardeners now in all of my classes. This is the most common mistake people make. They put it in dry soil because it's easy to open the dry soil, and then they water, and they usually regret it later. So that's number one. Okay, so number two, most common thing that people do when they're transplanting their babies is they plant it at the wrong time of the day. That really matters, especially if you're zone 9 and 10 and you're planting in October, even November when it's still really hot and the sun is very harsh. You do not want to plant your transplants in the middle of the day. Okay, it may be Saturday and you may have gotten done with your brunch and that's when you have time, but really if you can avoid planting during the hottest parts of the day, your transplants will be much happier. I have recommended to our gardeners and students that it's always a good idea to plant in the evening. Now let's think about why that is. In the evening, the sun is getting lower in the horizon, it's going to get dark, the temperatures are going to get cooler. The plant has a good 8 hours to acclimate to its new surroundings without being hit with harsh, intense UV light from the sun. So as a general rule of thumb, now it's morning time because we're shooting our video and it's very early and it's nice and cloudy and it's cool. This is an okay time to plant it. But if you're a brand new gardener, you've never transplanted your babies, they're very young and tender, plant them in the evening. I promise you, it will give you so much more room for error and they'll be less likely to wilt and die because they're not going to be exposed to the UV light. So another consideration when you're thinking about when to plant, not just about the time of the day, but also look at the weather for the week that's coming, right? Are we heading into a next, week of weather where it's gonna be 90, 95? I know that it's difficult because sometimes you go to the nursery, you get your plants, you're so excited, you want to put them in the ground, it's when you have time. But please avoid planting tender transplants before a heat wave, or really in zone 9 and 10, if the weather is going to be above 85 or about 85, you might want to think about avoiding transplanting them out until it gets a little bit cooler. Now, with our weather changes that we've been having, that might be impossible, and that's okay because I have some pro tips that can help you protect your plants even if we don't get cooler temperatures. So, tip number 3 is use some type of protection so that the plants are not being exposed to so much UV light. If you come over here, you can see we actually transplanted these plants out a week ago, and you can see they look great. I got a little bit of burn here on these guys. It's not the end of the world, and this burn is from too much UV light. Just like we can get sunburn, so can plants. So we planted these about a week ago, and we put the shade cloth up over them, and you could see I just very easily and quickly hung it over the plants. I didn't make this crazy infrastructure. I just wanted to protect them from the south-facing sun so that they can acclimate until our weather gets cooler. And you can see they've grown quite a bit. I've got these guys over here that are already crawling up my trellis. I'm very excited. These are sweet pea flowers, which you want to plant in the fall in zone 9 and 10 so they can overwinter. And so I'm protecting them. That's one type of protection. Let's go look at another type. This is called row cover. Basically what row cover is it's spun polyester. We have some really great videos on like the super geeky details about this product. Hi, Nepali! But basically what it is it's like a blanket over your plants. It's going to block out some of the UV light. And the other key thing that row cover is going to do is if you use a hoop, or even if you lay it on top, but you put something on the sides to hold it down, it's going to hold in moisture, which is so key. So you can actually see here, we've got a start. It's got a little bit of a burn on it, but not a big deal. It's totally going to live. You can see behind you, we have a beautiful row of broccoli that's been planted out. And now we're in late September, and these were planted about 2 weeks ago. It was very hot, but our weather is getting cooler and now they're really starting to thrive. Now let me show you what happens if you don't cover them. Here's a good example. So this little guy here, the wind had blown off my row cover and it was exposed to too much UV light, and you can see it got burned. What happens is they get burned and then they're more likely to get mowed down by insects, and all of these issues compound. So from the very beginning, you need to protect your baby crops from too much UV sunlight, right? And basically think of it like we put on sunscreen when we go to the beach. You can use row cover, which will hold in more moisture, or shade cloth, which will actually cut down the amount of UV light that your plants are getting. Keep in mind, I don't recommend going anything over really 50%. 40% shade cloth is the best for vegetable plants, because if you use a shade cloth that blocks too much UV light, they're going to be stunted because they're not going to get enough sunlight to grow, right? That's tip number 3. That is so important when you're transplanting your babies. Give them some extra protection by way of either shade cloth or row cover. If you don't have either of those things on hand, you can actually use burlap. That's what my grandparents used to protect their babies. Anything that's going to make the sun a little less harsh for them while they're acclimating to their new growing conditions. Now let's go on over here and I'll actually plant these guys out, and we'll talk about tip number 4. So tip number 4, which is so important, is you have to water frequently after you transplant your babies out. So this soil is already really moist. That's great. That's going to get me ahead of the game right there. But it would be a grave error for me to plant these guys out and then think, well, there's moisture in the soil, they'll be fine. I'll just water, you know, once a day or every other day. I'll just leave it on its regular irrigation. Not in our zone, not in our climate. If it's really hot, and especially if we're having Santa Ana conditions in zone 9 and 10, you have to water frequently. So when I transplant these guys out, what I will actually do, see how I'm breaking up these roots? As I'm breaking up the roots, they're more likely to wilt because I am pulling soil away from their roots. I'm breaking the roots, which means they're going to be less able to suck moisture around them. So what I will actually do when I transplant these guys out is I'm going to set my irrigation, which is this drip line here, and you may have different irrigation, everybody does, depending on their needs, or if you're hand watering. I am going to make sure that this watering system goes off every 12 hours. So it's a very simple way. You set it on your irrigation timer. I'm going to lessen the amount of time that it's running, but I'm going to increase the frequency that it runs. And that's because, again, this whole video really hinges on the idea of you don't want your baby seedlings to dry out. They're too young, they're too tender, their root masses are much too small to allow them to dry out and be able to recuperate. Because there's only this much root mass in this little transplant, if at any point they dry out, they're going to start sucking moisture from their leaves and wilting and dying. They cannot bounce back from too much wilt. So that's incredibly important. If you are hand watering, at this point I would water very well. Take your time. Do not just spritz them really quickly and then be done with it. Put your hose on maybe that little drip, drip, drip. Or I like to turn my hose on the lowest little setting and I sit here and I water for maybe a good 5-10 minutes. I'm not trying to rush that process. It's so very, very important. Then I'm gonna take mulch. You guys know how much I love mulch. It's in all of my videos. And I'm going to mulch heavily around my baby plants. That's because if for some reason the irrigation is not enough, we get too hot of weather, I want to do every single thing I can to try to avoid letting these guys dry out by putting mulch around them. I'm protecting them. I'm ensuring that there'll be less evaporation because the soil is not exposed to sunlight. So that's the 4 most important things you have to remember when you're transplanting your babies out in the fall or in any hot extreme weather. Okay, now don't forget, comment on this video so that you can be entered to win this very awesome hat. I would love to see somebody repping it in their garden with our logo on it. It made me so proud. So make sure you comment on this video and then subscribe to our newsletter, because that's where we will announce the winner. Until then, I'm so excited that you guys watched this video, and I want to hear about how your fall starts are doing. And please ask me, what do you need to know from me so that I can help you be as successful as possible?